And enjoy working with them. Well, here we go. Daughters of the American Revolution and sons of the American Revolution, I'm delighted to be here with you. Is it afternoon? Yes, this afternoon. It's a delight to be with you. All of these fine compatriots gathered in one room. It's fun to be part of you. I was honored to be inducted into the Sons of the American Revolution a few years ago. I've been to every one of these constitutional luncheons, Constitution Week luncheons, ever since, and I really enjoyed them. I was delighted when Danny asked me to come and speak today, following such distinguished speakers and friends as Judge John Denson, who's right back here. Judge, good to see you. Robert Cochran, my dear friend who spoke last year. Thank you for inviting me and allowing me to spend a little time with you today. We're going to talk about the Constitution, of course, and also some presidential precedents. So we had some questions last time. Where did all these precedents come from anyway? So I'll be talking a little bit about that, particularly the precedents that George Washington created. So let's see what we can do here. Oh, before I begin, ladies of DAR, do me a big favor. Talk to your husbands. Talk to your sons. Talk to your grandsons. Get them to join the SAR. Our best recruiting mechanism is the DAR. So please help us to recruit some new members. We would love to have them. Constitution and presidential precedents. Well, here we go. What I'm going to do in this presentation, first I'm going to talk about just briefly the Articles of Confederation. That was our first Constitution, and it was full of holes, folks. It was a problematic document with a lot of shortcomings that led to the recreation and the writing of the Constitution. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the shortcomings of the Confederation, Articles of Confederation, and I'm going to tell a few stories about the framing of the Constitution of the United States of America, the framework that it constructed. Now, we're all familiar with that framework from our civics classes. I wish they still taught them, don't you? The civics classes that we took in high school. I'm going to talk about how sinews and muscles are added to that skeleton, the strong bones of the Constitution. Some of the major precedents that George Washington established as first president. Nobody knew how to be president, so he started being president the way he thought it ought to be, and he set a lot of precedents that are still in effect today. I'll tell a few funny stories, and then I'm going to get serious and list some of the pillars of the presidency that George Washington established. So that's what we got in front of us today. Lots of sources of information about the U.S. Constitution. I bet you've got some in your own homes. You've probably read some in the library, law books, civic books, history books, articles, dissertations. Dear Wikipedia, you go to Wikipedia, website, artificial intelligence now, gosh. If I cited all the sources I've consulted over the years, I would spend the whole program talking about sources. You want to hear that? No. Thank you, because I'm not going to do that. That would become a very boring presentation, so you're going to have to trust me. See, trust me that I'm actually telling you the truth. But as Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify, right? So if you've got a different version or you want to talk about some of the things I say later, please talk to me after the luncheon. I'll be glad to hear from you. Maybe you can aim me in the right direction if I'm off base. Anybody seen this little pamphlet? Yeah? Yeah? Have you read it? This thing is great. Where did I get it? Well, I found it on the table at the first of these Constitution luncheons I came to, thanks to the host chapter, and I took it home and read it, and it's the source of a lot of what I'm going to talk about today. It's one of my favorites. If you don't have one, you can get it on Amazon. I think it's $2. It's money well spent. Anyway, the Articles of Confederation. This was our first Constitution. It was adopted on March the 1st of 1781. Wait a minute, I thought the Declaration of Independence, let's see, 1770. How were we governed before then? Well, we weren't. Each state had its own approach to governance, and each state did what it wanted to. So they got together finally in 1781 to put together these Articles of Confederation. And this is how the nation was governed during the latter stages of the Revolution and the early days of the nation. It's not much of a central government. In fact, there's no central government at all. It's basically a league of friendship. As you can see down there, they've listed all the states that are friends. In fact, it invited Canada, the provinces of Canada, to join the nation. They declined. The states had all the power. The states held all the power. They had the militias, they had the laws, they had the courts, they had all the power. Lots of shortcomings. I'm going to mention some of them on the next slide, but we don't want to be too critical of it. Read it. You'll find it interesting. It's a baby steps. The nation was trying to learn how to be a nation and how to govern itself. So it was the baby steps, if you will, toward a real plan for government. Shortcomings. Well, no power of taxation. Maybe that was a good thing. I don't know. But there was no power of taxation. That was a big problem. You see, we were fighting that Revolutionary War. We ran up a debt, a national debt of $42 million. And there was no taxation, no way to pay it. You could ask the states to pay it. Some of them chipped in some money. A lot of them didn't. So the nation started in debt, $42 million. And by the way, that's 1800's $42 million. I read that that's about $47 billion now. So the nation was in huge debt, had no way to pay it, and much of that debt was owed to those soldiers and militia people who had fought in the Revolution. Washington and Hamilton and others who had fought in the Revolution, they didn't want to see those soldiers unpaid. They were very upset about it. There was no regulation of commerce. Each state set its own tariff system, its own trade agreements with other nations and other states. That meant there was economic chaos in what was supposed to be a nation. There was no executive branch, so there was no way to enforce any of the laws if any did get adopted. So, and there was no diplomatic presence. Each state sent its own diplomats out. Can you imagine the confusion if we were governed that way now? There was no national judiciary. So one state would treat things one way, another a different way. And if the two states, if two or three states got into an argument, like frankly they did, over the Ohio Territory, etc., there was no way to resolve disputes among the states. Each state had equal voting power. One state, one vote. 13 states, 13 votes. It took 9 states to agree on anything. You think we could get any 9 states these days to agree on anything? I'm not sure. In those days, 9 states. So each state had equal voting power. The small states could block anything the big states wanted, and a minority of states could basically stall anything. And so really not much got done. Laws and amendments to pass a law under the Articles of Confederation, 9 states, as I said. An amendment took all 13 states. Boy, was that difficult. So there were no amendments to it. Weak national defense because there was no national defense. Congress could not draft soldiers, maintain a standing army. There was total reliance on the states to provide soldiers. That's why when you look back in the ancestry, you'll find all these militias and such a state regular army, etc. They were loaned to the Federals. They became the Federal Army under Washington. As you know, soldiers drifted in and out throughout the whole war, and it was very difficult. Poor attendance. Folks, frankly, didn't come to the meetings. Lack of central authority. They failed to show up. So not much got done at all. Very clearly there was a need for a new kind of government. consequences: economic instability, diplomatic embarrassment, different states offering different things, inability to enforce any treaties that the nation might make, failure to suppress internal unrest. Was there internal unrest during the days of the Revolution? You betcha. But there was no way to suppress it. Vulnerability to foreign threats, because there was no standing army, and an unworkable arrangement. It just didn't work. So a new constitution was needed. And the folks who called the convention, Washington and Hamilton and Madison and others, the folks who called for it, they did it a sneaky way. They called for a meeting to amend or revise the Articles of Confederation. What they really came up with was a whole new constitution for the United States of America. So here's some important dates. I want you to memorize all of these and read all of this stuff, okay? Here we go. On May the 25th of 1787, the Constitutional Convention opened. 7 states were represented. They met in Philadelphia, and they talked about revising those articles. All the states eventually sent delegates, except Rhode Island. Rhode Island was intensely opposed to any kind of federal government, so they didn't even send delegates. September the 17th, you notice that's about 100 days. Took them 100 days. Representatives from the 12 states approved the Constitution. The one that didn't approve was Rhode Island. They weren't there. 39 delegates signed it of the 42 present. Why didn't the others sign it? Well, Judge Denson explained that to us a few years ago. They were upset because there was no Bill of Rights in the original Constitution. That was the big block. So eventually the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists worked out an agreement. The Federalists said, the first thing we're going to do in the House of Representatives is propose a Bill of Rights. Will you sign it now? And on trust they did. June the 21st, the Constitution became effective. You see, after it came out of there, it had to go to each state to be ratified because they were still under the Articles of Confederation. So each state had to ratify it. Thank goodness 9 of them did. New Hampshire was the 9th state, and then we became a nation. The others eventually signed it as well. February 4th of, look at that, 1789. That's 2 years after the convention came together. February 4th of 1780, we had the first presidential election. Now, we talk about, gosh, we'd like to have the results the next morning. The results were not known until April the 6th, when finally all the votes from the electors were collected together and announced. The first Congress convened on March the 4th of 1789 in New York City, the temporary capital. There was no Washington, D.C. It hadn't been built yet. Washington hadn't even been elected, or at least they didn't know it. On April 6th, they finally found out. George Washington was elected the first president under the new Constitution. He got 69 electoral votes, I think, which was just about all of them. There was a little more contention for vice president. John Adams was elected vice president. He got 34 votes, which was the most of the electors. George Washington was finally inaugurated April the 30th of 1789. So between the time the Constitution was adopted and the time he was inaugurated, we didn't have a government at all. It's kind of interesting to know. So, more dates to remember. Here we go. Looks like a history lesson, doesn't it? June 8 of 1789, my birthday. But I was not alive then. James Madison held up his end of the bargain. He introduced a proposed Bill of Rights in the House of Representatives. Madison, very much a Federalist, he introduced the Bill of Rights. September the 4th of 1789, Congress established a Supreme Court. You notice the Constitution states that there will be a Supreme Court, and it was established by law on September 24, as well as 13 district courts, 3 circuit courts, and the position of Attorney General. To whom did the Attorney General report? We don't know. That wasn't specified. Congress approved the 12 amendments in September 25th, sent them to the states. 3/4 of the states had to adopt them for them to become amendments, part of the Constitution. 10 of them were selected. The Supreme Court met for the first time on February the 2nd of 1790. Great! There was no docket. There were no cases before them, so they made no decisions. They didn't even have a courtroom. They borrowed a room from one of the Congress committee rooms and met there. Since they didn't have any docket, they adjourned. How about that? December the 15th, Virginia finally became the final state to ratify the Bill of Rights. At that point, it became part of the Constitution. 10 of the 12 were accepted and became the Bill of Rights. Another very important date happened a little later, February 24 of 1803. Now, the judge can tell us, and anybody who's an attorney or studied this, Marbury versus Madison, one of the most important decisions ever made by the Supreme Court. Here's what Chief Justice John Marshall said: "A law repugnant to the Constitution is null and void." This established the court's ability to review laws, to review decisions, to review actions, and if they were not constitutional, they were declared null and void. So at that point, the Supreme Court pretty much became equal to the other two branches of government. Isn't that a beautiful painting? Has anybody seen the real one in the Capitol? That's beautiful, isn't it? That is gorgeous. It's gorgeous. It wasn't really like that. We all know that, don't we? It wasn't really like this. This never happened. That's a romantic picture. Here's how it really was. At no time were all the delegates present for an entire session. They drifted in and out during the entire. Sometimes people would go back home. Other people would drop by. They met behind closed doors. Interesting. Behind closed doors. And they were sworn to secrecy. They couldn't talk to anybody else about what they were doing inside that building. No official minutes were kept. Thank goodness James Madison had a little diary, and he jotted in there some of the stuff that happened each day. That's how we know about the compromises and discussions and so on. Madison had brought with him, he's sometimes called the father of the Constitution, Madison had brought with him the Constitution of the state of Virginia. He had helped draft it. He knew what it said. He said, now this is a good model for the nation. And in fact, you'll see a lot of similarities. The debates were gentlemanly, but very contentious. A lot of argument, a lot of discussion. The Federalists wanted a strong central government. The Anti-Federalists wanted a Bill of Rights for the people and a strong role for the individual states. The discussions, we know, spilled over into the local taverns. I don't know how they kept it secret, but they did. Hotel meeting rooms, etc. There were lots of compromises. That was one great thing about these gentlemen who were convened. They were willing to listen to one another, talk to one another, and find workable solutions. So there were lots of compromises made that led to the final structure. There was no final signing ceremony like that gorgeous picture. That didn't actually happen. That was a painting done in 1940 by Howard Chandler Christie, and it does hang in the nation's capital. The delegates signed the document at various times and places. If you look carefully at the original document, you will see Pennsylvania is misspelled. How about that? Misspelled on the original document. George Washington and James Madison were there. They were the only presidents of the nation who actually signed the Constitution. Many of the others hadn't been born yet, of course. Thomas Jefferson, where was he? Well, he was in France serving as a U.S. minister. He was our ambassador to France under the Articles of Confederation. John Adams was our ambassador, if you will, to England, so they were not there. The oldest person to sign the Constitution, on a $100 bill, there he is, Benjamin Franklin, at the age of 81. He was very much involved in the writing of the Constitution. He was so sick they had to carry him in a sedan chair to each session. When he said, I'm getting chills for this, remember this, When he signed the Constitution, he did it with tears streaming down his face. Tears of pride. He never thought he'd see that day. How about that? They built a solid framework for us. This is what it was all about. This was part of the genius of the Constitution. Don't spell out everything. Instead, lay out a strong skeleton, and then we can hang the meat and the sinews and stuff on it as we proceed. They set up a bicameral, a two-house Congress. Their job was to propose, debate, and adopt laws. Each state has equal representation in the Senate, 2 senators. The House of Representatives is based on state population. And both houses have to agree before a bill is sent to the president to be signed. In other words, they found a compromise so that each state had equal representation, but also states were represented by population. Some of you might remember the 3/5 compromise. If you're not familiar with that, look that up. The 3/5 compromise. Who was counted as 3/5 of a person? I'll leave you to find that out. They set up an executive branch that was headed by the president. The president's job was to carry out and enforce the laws passed by Congress. And then they set up this court system headed by the Supreme Court. Their job was to interpret laws as they applied to individual cases. When that Marbury versus Madison decision came down, it really strengthened the role of the Supreme Court. At that point, from then on, they've had the authority of judicial review. They can review laws passed by the states as well as the federal government. They can review executive orders. And if they find that they are not constitutional, they declare them null and void. We see that going on frequently. Okay, so there we go. That's the skeleton. How was the meat put on to our federal government? Here it is. Muscle and sinews. The Constitution did not spell out how. Can you imagine a Constitution written a couple of hundred years ago still relevant today? Well, they did it by building that skeleton with the idea that other aspects of how the government operated could be determined in several ways. Muscles and sinews. The law passed by Congress. So Congress would pass laws that would establish the muscles. Executive orders and actions taken by the president would establish how the government was operated. And decisions made by the lower courts and the Supreme Court. This is how laws would be interpreted. So that's where the muscle came from. Laws can be changed, decisions can be overturned, etc. And so the Constitution is still relevant. How many times has it been amended? Only 27. 27, and the first 10 were the Bill of Rights. So it's only been amended 17 times. And by the way, one of those amendments overturned another one. That's why we can drink alcohol these days. So the Constitution doesn't need to be amended except in extraordinary circumstances. Typically, the laws are made in the way I've just mentioned. Well, so George Washington, first president. How exciting. Here's what he did. He went into his office, which was in his home, just like it is now. He went into his home in New York, and he wrote letters back to all the people who had congratulated him, and he visited with people who dropped by, and he looked around and found he didn't have any work to do. Man of action with no work to do. He became very jealous of John Adams. There was John Adams down there presiding over the Senate, making big decisions over how long, and he was just sitting there waiting for the Senate to act. Well, a man of action doesn't spend a lot of time that way. There was no established procedure for what he was to do, so he made a lot of decisions himself. He said, well, I'm the first president, so I'll be president the way I think it ought to be done. And the things that he decided set precedents that we even respect today for the work of the presidency. Article 2 of the United States Constitution establishes the executive branch, right? We're all familiar with that. Executive branch. President and Vice President. It lays out the electoral process, the duties and powers of the presidency, the constraints on the actions of the president, but it doesn't provide any details about how the job's to be done. So Washington went about providing those details. He did it the way he thought he ought to do it. Now, I wish I were smart enough to understand all of this, but I had another source. I wave this one in front of you. Here's my source for what I'm about to talk about next. A book by Harlow Giles Unger. It's called Mr. President, George Washington and the Making of the Nation's Highest Office. I commend it to you. It's a wonderful, easy read, and it really taught me a lot about where these precedents came from. So I'm going to share knowledge that Unger taught me. If you recognize that name, there may be a reason for that. Do you recognize the author? Judge, you do, don't you? You recognize that author. That's right, because he also wrote another book. It was about Richard Henry Lee, who indeed is related to the other Lees. That was all one family. Unger's book about Richard Henry Lee, who was one of the anti-federalists demanding that there be a Bill of Rights. He's a namesake of our local SAR chapter. And Judge Denson spoke about him about 3 years ago when he spoke to this group. He recommended the book to us. It's great. Many of us in the SAR have read it. I commend it to you too. Unger has written a lot of books about the Founding Fathers. And they're all terrific. I do recommend them to you. Here's Unger's list of all the things that George Washington did that became precedents for how presidents are to operate. He opened the White House. He made certain that government was open so we could see what goes on, unless it's one of those closed committees. But we can go and watch the House and the Senate, and we can watch what goes on in the White House. He toured the nation to see and touch the people. He wanted a president who was close to the people. He prohibited appointment, look at that, prohibited appointment of government officials who were his relatives and friends. How about that? How about that? He said, no, you're going to have to earn it. He said that even to his brother-in-law. No, you got to earn it to be appointed. I don't want this to be a Washington family operation. By the way, notice up there in blue, government officials are servants of the people rather than their rulers. That's what George Washington said. Servants of the people rather than their rulers. Regional representation. When it was time to make executive appointments to the cabinet, he made sure that they didn't all come from one state or one region. He wanted the entire nation represented in his cabinet. He did bring the cabinet together. He had the first cabinet meeting. We still have cabinet meetings. He set up control over the executive branch decisions. Believe me, he was a decisive man himself. He restricted, this is interesting. Congress was calling him down there, you know, just about every day. President, Mr. President, come in here and tell us what you think about this or that or the other. He said, no, I'm not going to, I'm part of the executive branch, not part of the legislative branch. I'm not going to come running down here every time you ask me a question. If you want me to speak to you, I will, but I will only speak at a joint session of Congress. Interesting. State of the Union address, which he presented to a joint session of Congress. He set that precedent. Senatorial courtesy in judicial appointments. Well, you know, they had those lower courts, and when judges were appointed, the president had that power. He talked to the senators from those states to get their advice before he made appointments. Presidential discretion in sending troops to war without congressional approval. How in the world did he do that? We'll talk about that in a second. He was the first to give a farewell address, and every president since him has given a farewell address. And what about this term limit? He said 2 terms is enough. In fact, after his first 4-year term, he said, boy, that wore me out. That's enough. I'm going back home to the farm. They said, no, we need you for another term. So he accepted a second term, and after that he said, that's all a president needs to serve is 2 terms. And that was not written into law. It just became a precedent. And so that was a precedent for all the way until Franklin Roosevelt, who was elected 4 times. Didn't quite get to serve much of that 4th term, unfortunately, but elected 4 times. And immediately after Truman's presidency, they passed a law in 1951. They passed the 22nd Amendment, going back to 2-term limit. Thank you, George. Okay. Now, a few stories. What shall we call the president? Good question, isn't it? Will the president use his residence for entertaining and open it to the public, or will he keep it closed? Will he stay in office, stay there meeting with his cabinet, or is he going to travel around the country? Will he call out the troops when he thinks it's necessary? Did George Washington use executive privilege? And how long is a man going to stay in office? Well, here are the stories. What shall we call the president? Look at that. Look at that. That really exists. There's a statue of him as kind of a Greek god, if you will. This was the first thing Adams brought up. The House was talking about the Bill of Rights. Adams, as president of the Senate, said, okay, our first order of business, we got the man coming for his inauguration. What are we going to call him? Well, one senator said, let's call him Your Highness. Another said, how about Your Most Benign Highness? His Exalted Highness. He said, no, he's not king. Well, how about Elective Highness? Your Elective Highness. How about that? Most Illustrious and Excellent President. His Majesty the President was proposed. And then some wag said, why not just call him King George IV? That really was a joke, but it really happened. And then John Adams proposed, very seriously, His Highness, the President of the United States and Protector of the Rights of the Same. It's quite a mouthful, isn't it? His Highness, President of the United States and Protector of the Rights of the Same. They got 9 votes, folks. 9 votes. You say, oh, well, that would... Well, remember, there were only 13 states. That meant there were 26 senators. That meant that 14 votes would carry. You got 9. We were close, weren't we? Finally, somebody said, why don't we just call him Mr. President? Washington liked that one. He said, yeah, call me Mr. President. And that was where the tradition came from ever since our president has been Mr. President, the President of the United States. Will he use his residence for entertaining? Will he open it to the public? Well, let's think about the man. There he is with his family. There's Martha Custis Washington and her 2 grandchildren who Washington adopted as his children. His favorite manservant is here, who he considered part of the family. George Washington was married to the richest woman in the country. Martha Custis was a very wealthy widow when they married. So he was very wealthy. He was a great dancer. He was known perhaps as the greatest dancer in the nation. He loved to dance with all the women at the party. He has an Epicurean taste. We all know that. He loved good food, good wine, good ale. He was a social man, loved being around his family. What do you think? Open or closed? He closed it. He closed it. He said, this is my home, this is my residence, this is my escape from the pressures of the office. That lasted 2 weeks. Then he and Martha talked, let's throw a big party and invite everybody. Ever since then, it's been open. So he set that precedent of let's have the White House open for visitors. It wasn't a White House at the time, but the president's residence. Will he stay in his office or travel around the country? Well, here he is with his first cabinet. Let's see, there's Washington, and let's see, that's Knox there next to him. And then we've got Hamilton and Jefferson and Edmund Randolph, who was the first Attorney General. So that was his original cabinet. And by the way, who did the Attorney General end up reporting to? President, yeah. He said, look, anybody who's in the executive office, and that included Jefferson, who had already been appointed Secretary of State under the Articles, and it included Knox, his dear friend and Secretary of War. He said, the cabinet reports to me. It's part of the executive branch. It reports to me. Is he going to hang around with them? Is that how he's going to spend his time? Is he going to travel around and meet people? Well, there he is. That was him as general. That was him as president. He whirled around and met the people, shaked hands, kissed the babies. Washington slept here. We know that, don't we? Okay. Will the president call out the troops? We're going to hear more about this in just a minute when I give the formal part. But look at there. See that village burning? Out on the western part of the nation, Ohio Territory, the western part of the Carolinas, there were Indian uprisings. They were setting fires. They were marauding. They were murdering people. The president realized these are citizens of the USA. It's my job to protect them. Do you think he sent out the troops? Yes, he did. Did he have authority to? No, he didn't, but he sent them out. Later, when there was a rebellion over taxes, Shays' Rebellion, and then later the Whiskey Rebellion, when there was a rebellion, and a lot of these were mostly Revolutionary War soldiers who hadn't yet been paid and yet were being taxed. And they were upset with the government. They had a rebellion. He put on his uniform and he turned to Hamilton, who was a major general, and said, come on, we're going to put it down. Led a whole column of troops, met the rioters, and there was no bloodshed. He convinced them, I'm going to take care of it. I'm going to get you paid. Just hang on a little bit longer. And the rebellion ended. Yes, he sent out the troops to defend the people. Did he use executive privilege? What do you think? Yes, he did. He was the first. In fact, he created the idea of executive privilege. England and France were at war. France wanted the United States to join them, just like France had joined in with the revolution. They felt like the U.S. needed to join them on their side and go to war with England. Washington didn't want another war with England. He sent John Jay as his ambassador, personal representative, sent letters back and forth across the ocean to Jay to keep up with what was going on in England. Congress said, we want to see those letters. We want to see what you're saying. Washington said, no. Those are privileged letters. They're part of my administration. I'm not going to turn them over to Congress. Congress backed down, so he got his way. Executive privilege. How long did he stay in office? Well, we know that answer. He stayed for 2 terms, 8 years, and then he waved his hat and rode off back to the farm. There's a picture, by the way, of his farewell address. You can get that from Congress or any bookstore. 7 pillars. Now, this is the serious part of the presentation. Unger said there's 7 pillars that he established that created a strong presidency. The president led foreign policy. The president made executive appointments. The president oversaw government finances. The president would lead military affairs. The president could proclaim things through executive orders. The president could enforce federal law and executive privilege. Those are the 7 pillars that he established. Look at those 2 pictures. The first, of course, we recognize, don't we? That's George Washington. Who's the second one? That's artificial intelligence effort to show what he would look like if he were president today. Good-looking fella, isn't he? President George, there he is. What he looked like today. I thought that was cute. Foreign policy. Now, this is all fine print, folks, and you can read it all if you want to. The Constitution said the president had the power, with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties, as long as 2/3 of the Senate approved, to appoint ambassadors, etc., public ministers. Now, the Senate said, hey, that business on advice and consent, if you send us a treaty, that means we advise you very carefully. In fact, John Adams, on the first treaty that Washington sent to him, went through clause by clause. And he read the clause, he said, do we advise and consent or not? When Washington heard about this, he blew his stack. He blew his top. And it says, it actually says, it's from his diary, in a fret. Okay, I'm sure he was. He stormed down there and he said, look, the framers said I write the treaties with your advice and consent. And I don't know if you can see it in the fine print there, but there's two little commas that I put in green. Do you happen to see those? It's between Senate and to make treaties. And then, let's see, there's another one up there between power and, he says it reads, the president shall have the power to make treaties, period. I make the treaties. Then I'll send them to you, and you can advise and consent all you want, and you vote on the final treaty. You don't have a say in every word how I write the treaties. Well, they said, okay. And they passed a law. And said, okay, Mr. President, you're right. So from there on out, the treaties that are now sent to the Senate, only the final treaty is voted upon, up or down. If it's voted down, then the president rewrites it or rejects it along the way. But President Washington got his way. There he is winking at us. He got his way. Executive appointments. The Constitution says the president shall nominate. Oh boy, there's that parent, with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint. Okay, so he can nominate them and he can appoint them. Can he tell them what to do? Can he fire them if he wants to? Constitution doesn't say. So what do you think he did? He said, yeah, I got that power. And the first Secretary of War, he was not pleased with the man's performance, and he wanted to dismiss him, and so he fired him and appointed John Knox. And the Senate said, wait a minute, there's nothing in the Constitution says you can fire him. He said, well, I sure can. And so he demanded a congressional act. He said, pass a law saying that I can. Folks, it was debated, and in the Senate, it was a tie vote. It was that close. John Adams, Washington's close friend, was the tiebreaker as president of the Senate. So now the president has a right to dismiss and as a result to demand certain types of performance. That power was given to the president under Washington's administration. He got his way. Government finances, there's nothing in the Constitution says that the president has anything to do with finances. Did you know that? Nothing. Congress has the power. You see there, Congress has the power. Lay and collect taxes, duties, imports, excises. By the way, that's tariffs, so you can read tariffs. Pay the debts of the U.S., borrow money. Well, Hamilton, who was Secretary of the Treasury, got together with the president and said, we got to pay all these old soldiers. We can't have them out there. We promised them at Shays' Rebellion. So they established the Bank of the United States. They got Congress to do it, Congressional Act, established the Bank of the United States, which then gave the Treasury and the president, in effect, the power to borrow on the credit of the United States. We still have a national bank. Do we borrow and sell bonds and such? Sure we do. The president got his way. He's winking at us again there. Military affairs. President shall be commander-in-chief. That's pretty clear, isn't it? Commander-in-chief. But then there's a little clause. When these soldiers and sailors are called into actual service. When they're not in service, he's not commander-in-chief. Congress has the power. Read that? Congress has the power to provide for common defense, declare the war, raise and support armies, navies, etc. Call forth the militia, discipline the militia. All Congress has that authority. Now, this is a man who was the general, the commanding general of the federal troops. When he was faced with those Indian attacks on American settlements, he didn't hesitate. Congress was in recess. They didn't declare any war. He sent the troops. He sent the troops. Well, that was unilaterally assumed extra-constitutional power. He just did it on his own. Now, when Congress came back into session, they were stuck because they weren't about to tell a president he couldn't defend the western border against these Indian attacks. So they said, well, okay. They passed the Militia Act, which then gave the president the right to call forth the militia in times of emergency so that he could take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Originally, they said a federal judge must agree it's an emergency, but they took that out. So now the president has all but unfettered powers to call up the troops and send them into conflicts without the consent of Congress. Has that been done? Yes. It's been done a lot. The U.S. has been involved in a lot of wars. We know that, more than a dozen when the little book was written by Unger, more now. And we were involved in Korea, we were involved in Vietnam, we were involved in the Desert Storm, we were involved in lots of wars, Grenada, lots of wars, lots of places. Congress has only declared war 5 times. Did you know that? Only 5 times. They declared war in 1812. They certainly were at war. They declared war against Mexico in 1846, Spanish-American War in 1898, World War I and World War II. Those are the only declared wars that we've had. All the rest of those military actions have been due to the precedent set by President Washington. Executive order. Oh boy. Well, okay. No Constitution. It's not in the Constitution. You can look at it. You can find it. You won't find it. No, and were there any restrictions? No, but there was a 10th Amendment that says anything that's not specifically in this Constitution as a duty is reserved by the states and the people. So the president had no power or no restrictions. So he did it. He did it anyway. He said, well, let's do it. Let's see what happens. He did it. He assumed the power to issue a proclamation with the force of law when he saw fit. And he did so in the Neutrality Agreement. Remember I said England and France were at war? Okay, well, France wanted us to join on their side. Washington said, oh, we better not. We'll be in war with England. I don't want that. So he declared. He didn't go to Congress. He declared the United States to be at peace with Britain, France, and all other combatants. And then he said, I don't want any ships, any sailors involved. Nobody's going to ship armaments to either nation. We're going to be strictly neutral. Did Congress say that? Congress didn't have a thing to do with it. He declared that, and he got his way. Congress said, okay, we'll look the other way. So, and they did, and he got his way. And so we've had legislation by presidential proclamation ever since. Now, if it's challenged in the court and the court finds it's unconstitutional, that's one thing. Otherwise, the president has that power, and it's been used, certainly, over the past several decades. Federal law enforcement. President shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. But he didn't have any troops or anything. He didn't have any, there was no FBI. How was he going to do it? Well, there was no law enforcement arm, so what he did, he unilaterally just decided to send the federal troops against the Indian marauders, and he called up the troops to crush the tax protests in western Pennsylvania. He assumed the powers, and he got his way. Congress said, well, okay, you're the president, and ever since, we've seen it done that way. Okay, so President Washington, there he is winking at us again. And finally, executive privilege. Constitution doesn't have anything to say about executive privilege. Nothing in there except that 10th Amendment. Congress said, wait a minute, there's no mention of executive privilege in there. The president doesn't have any executive privilege. But he did get his way. I'm not going to tell the story again about John Jay and the letters, but that's how he got his way. So he established the concept of executive privilege. And in fact, he asserted a new principle of the separation of powers. That was Washington, folks. He said, separation of powers. There are 3 branches, and the branches shall operate separately. In fact, there's the quotation. The boundaries fixed by the Constitution between the different departments should be preserved. Executive department has its way, legislature and the courts have their way. So he got his way again. Well, that's about all I have to say to you. Terry Jordan, who wrote that little pamphlet, and Professor Unger, who provided me all that information, and President Washington himself, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation. That is the end. Okay? Now, boy, I've rattled on a long time. We could take questions all afternoon. What I recommend we do, if you have questions or comments or you want to check my facts, meet with me after the luncheon and I'll be glad to talk with you. But please, please do not ask me questions about politics or current events. Okay? I'm not going to speak on those. I'm a pastor. I'm not a politician. And if you want a copy of these slides or you want me to come and present to you, just let me know. There's my email address. Thanks, folks, for listening. You've been a great audience.